No, it's bad. Actually, I was thinking when you were talking about Joan Rivers that Judy Gold, who's a current
Oh,
comedian,
she's funny.
um, uh, is addressing some of the stuff going on. She and Joan Rivers have some similar things, but I'd say Judy's more blue in her language. But anyway, uh, there's certainly, and she certainly talked about how you have to have comedians. You have to.
Yeah, she's funny. I like her comedy acts.
Hmm.
Um, she every now and again, her and other comedians will go to Zabar's and just do the funniest things imaginable.
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, if I get stressed, I will watch an episode or two of Seinfeld.
Yeah, there you go.
Don't
Me
have to
too.
remember anything. I can just enjoy their crazy comedy, and yeah, it's good.
I probably know every episode by heart, Patricia.
Well, maybe we could do it together then. I probably know the words too.
Yeah, we could lip sync together. Yeah.
Every once in a while, I will go, hello.
Yes.
Cool.
Uh,
It's funny you mentioned Seinfeld earlier today for like an hour. I had the George answering machine in my head. Believe it or not, George isn't at home. Please leave a message at the beep. It was in
yeah.
my head for whatever reason. I don't know why, but it cracks me up every time I think about it.
Uh-huh.
She's heard out.
So we're gonna start the service at 7:35. But meanwhile, yeah, just feel free to interact.
Anna, how are you doing? Oh,
Oh,
you're
you're
muted, Anna.
muted.
I'm fine. I mean, not all the news is bad. I think what's going on in Iran is amazing.
Well, if it leads to regime change, it would be. But
Will be, but I mean, in the past 2 years, after October 7th, I was terrified of Iran. And in the past 2 years, Iran has changed.
yeah. But we've been in that this exact story before, meaning there have been massive protests a fair number of times. And these protests, while they're intense, seem to be fairly rudderless. They don't seem to have a natural leaders to them. So I'm, mark me a skeptic of it, and I sincerely do hope for that at some at some point the regime changes.
No, I understand, but I mean, I have to hand it to those people. They're
Yeah,
their lives
yep,
in their hands. And
definitely putting your life in your hand when you protest the regime there.
And
Iran,
it's
Iran
really
has lost a lot of
impressive.
power in the last 2 years. I'm not as terrified of Iran as I was 2 years ago.
Well, that is good.
I also think their courage is just
Inspiring.
inspiring, even if they get put down again.
Yeah.
It's impressive.
No, we both mouthed the word inspiring at the same time.
Okay, friends, we're going to start our service. I'm going to put everyone here on mute, and we will going to share the screen with the Havdalah service, and then shortly after the Havdalah service, we will have our program. Okay, one second. Okay. Havdalah means distinction in Hebrew, and the traditional Havdalah service seeks to create a distinction between Shabbat and its myriad of rules and the rest of the week, between rest and work. What does Havdalah mean for secular Jews? Well, it can mean much of the same thing, though we do not feel bound by particular Shabbat rules, and rest means something different for each individual. We can all acknowledge, however, that it is vitally important to create boundaries between work and leisure for our mental and physical health. But Havdalah goes beyond this and explores the notion of distinction in general, and thus may serve as a moment to contemplate our place in the world. The traditional Havdalah service distinguishes between what is sacred and profane. As humanists, we may instead examine our order of priorities, what is important to us and what is not. The traditional Havdalah service distinguishes between light and dark, which represent good and evil. As humanists, we know that this distinction is sometimes not as clear-cut. The traditional Havdalah service distinguishes between Jews and non-Jews, which we may reject as racist. As humanists, we can use Havdalah to think of our place in the world and the communities we belong to. The Havdalah service seeks to accomplish this through engaging all our senses. Rebecca? We seek the contrast of the flame from the Havdalah candle and the darkness of the room. And we remember to be deliberate in our choices between light and dark. We smell the pleasant aroma of the spices and its contrast with the other odors around us, and remember to be conscientious and make life pleasant for others. We taste the wine and the schnapps, marking this moment as important, and think of our place in the world and as part of our community. We touch and link arms with our friends and family as we gaze for a moment into the flames. We hear the song wishing us a good week.
Shavua Tov. Oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong Shavua Tov. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Shavua Tov, 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 Shavua Tov. A good week of peace. May gladness reign and joy increase. A good week of peace. May gladness reign and joy increase. Shavua Tov, Shavua Tov, Shavua Tov,
Thank you, everyone. We will shortly begin our service, but before that, just a few announcements. So, about upcoming programs. So, on Sunday, we meet for Kids School. As an adult perspectives at Kids School, I teach a class on modern Jewish history. This is open to members and their guests. It's in person, but it is also being streamed on Zoom. If you're interested, you can contact me or you can register on our website. Then our next Shabbat service is I'm going to be presenting on Friday night. Is it next week or the week after, Dahlia?
It's January 23rd, so
January 23rd. So in a couple weeks, I'm presenting. I recently visited Israel. As many of you know, I'm an Israeli expat, and I was there, and I'm coming back to just present on how the war in Gaza has changed Israel, and just how it's affected our own sister communities and Israeli society at large. And that will be in another 2 weeks. Our regular classes continue. So on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I teach reading the Bible through humanist eyes at 10:30 a.m. On the first and third Thursdays of each month at 7:30 p.m. I teach Introduction to Judaism. And then on Monday nights, there's our again online, there's a Talmud class. Okay. Yes, Dahlia.
I just want to emphasize that the Shabbat that the rabbi is giving about Israel is in person at SAJ, and that we have one on the history of Black and Jewish unity online on February 6th, and the Purim Shabbat in person on February 27th, and a lot of other stuff. Please look online. Put it on your calendars.
Thank you, Dahlia. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it to our presenter. Would you like to introduce him, Kathy?
Sure, yes. So Dr. Isaac Amon is a lecturer in law at Washington University School of Law in St. Louis and executive director and scholar-in-chief of the Sinai Legal Association for Memory and Modernity, an institute dedicated to the study of law, history, and the global Jewish experience. He previously served as a legal fellow at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague and as an ISIS war crimes investigator. A grandson of Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi immigrants to the United States in the 20th century, he speaks widely on the legacies of anti-Semitism and Jewish resilience with a particular focus on the Inquisition and the Holocaust. He's been a speaker for us in the past and is always a delight. His talks are wildly informative, and I sincerely hope that you all enjoy it. Thank you, Dr. Isaac.
Yep, thank you, Kathy. I'll share my PowerPoint with everyone. So we're good. Everyone can see? Okay, great. So yeah, Shavua Tov. Thank you for inviting me back, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation and find it informative. Just as a brief note, if you were here last time, I was here in 2024. I spoke more about the legacy of the Inquisition and how it came to bear on the founding of the United States, and the religious liberty is expressed or embodied, of course, in the First Amendment to the Constitution. So I will briefly mention it at the very end, but this talk is much more on the background as to how the secret Jews, the hidden Jews, the crypto Jews kind of came to be, and their kind of global migrations that, of course, in a sense, from the American perspective, culminate again in the birth of the United States and religious liberty against such a long background of persecution. So Jews lived in Spain and Portugal, or Iberia, or Sepharad, as it's known in Hebrew, for at least 1,500 to 2,000 years, with a well-documented history of a communal presence, certainly by Roman times, during the time of the Roman Empire. There were periods, of course, of remarkable integration, of triumph of the so-called Golden Age, but it was also punctuated by periods of persecution, of massacres, of forced conversions. And again, for our purposes, again, just to provide the context, we have the Spanish Inquisition came to exist via papal bull in 1478 and the Portuguese Inquisition in 1536. Now, all Inquisitions, and there was a medieval Inquisition earlier than the Spanish and Portuguese, and there was a contemporary Roman model that notoriously tried Galileo for heresy in the 1600s. But the Spanish and the Portuguese, the Iberian Inquisitions, came to singularly obsess over one type of heresy. Certainly in the formative period, say the first half century, in the case of Spain. Portugal maintained an emphasis much greater. But this is, of course, on crypto-Judaism, on the hidden Jews. Now, once Jews had been forcibly converted to Catholicism, in most cases, they came to be known officially by the state and the church as New Christians, to distinguish them from the so-called Old Christians, who were not Jewish or whose ancestors had not been Jewish. They also are known as conversos, for the converted. Pejoratively, as you may know, the term was moranos, meaning pig or swine. And there's another term that's increasingly in vogue in Hebrew, anusim, for people, meaning forced or coerced. So the B'nai Anusim, descendants today of those whose, again, of those who were converted, principally in Spain and Portugal. Now, for the Inquisition, right, heresy was a grievous sin, it put in peril the immortal soul. And so the Inquisition detailed or compiled or promulgated detailed legal procedures as how to uncover heresy. And perhaps not surprisingly, because heresy is a crime of the mind, so to speak, it's a thought crime, the only way to really uncover it is to have the individual confess. And so confession became known as the queen of proofs in legal parlance. Torture was utilized, such as the rack or this pulley-based system, though it's with less frequency than we probably assume. But three crucial legal principles under which the Inquisition operated was that a person was presumed to be guilty upon arrest or denunciation. So there was no presumption of innocent until proven guilty. The second is the proceedings were infamously kept secret. The person, the accused, the prisoner, was never to be informed of the charges against them. And lastly, they were not permitted to know the names or identity of the accusers or witnesses against them, thus effectively precluding, as we can rightly assume, any adequate defense, a truly Kafkaesque situation. And this inquisitorial process culminates in the so-called auto de fe, the grand act of faith, staged in many urban cities and great fora, almost always in public, sometimes in private, but certainly from our image in public, in full view. It'd be lists of penitents, prayers, and sermons going usually to the outskirts of the town where the condemned, those who were impenitent, refused to confess their errors. They would be burnt alive and burnt at the stake before the multitudes. And this, of course, had the effect of not only showing, of course, the evils of heresy, but of inculcating in the faithful of those who were present, again, the evils of hell, right? The hellfire that would await them if they followed in the path of those who were condemned. Now, this is a very important portrait or painting, I should say, because this is one of the most significant autos de fe that ever occurred in Iberian history. And this is of the grand auto de fe in Madrid, in the Plaza Mayor in 1680. And this, I believe, is the image that we have in popular consciousness. It's significant because you can see that you have the king and the queen located in the central balcony. Royalty graced the presence of the auto de fe. We have the Grand Inquisitor, a whole host of lesser-ranking inquisitors, dignitaries, and notables situated on the balconies in the Plaza Mayor, right, above the apartments. We have other people who came from dozens of miles around to see, as well as family members, because once an individual came to be accused of heresy, their families would quickly become suspect as well. Now, the central part is the crucial part to focus on. You have here faceless forms. These are the ordinary people, the tens of thousands of people who converged in the Plaza Mayor. They had to install a second story to accommodate the sheer number of people, to have, again, royalty and major officials on the top and the local populace below, and the accused are at the very bottom are in the dock. They are wearing a San Benito, the penitential garment, which overlay their outer clothing. It has an X or flames. Sorry about that. To showcase again, they're going to be burnt at the stake, and they're also wearing the Karoza dunce's cap to further humiliate them in the eyes of the public. And once this is done, they will be taken by the soldiers in the foreground to the place of execution, to the burning place on the outskirts of the city. Everything is meticulously staged, full of pomp and circumstance. The Inquisition in Spain had been operating for a decade and a half when the Alhambra decree came forth, when the Jews were expelled from Spain in March of 1492. Maybe not, of course, autos de fe on the great level that we just saw. That's again 17th century, but it was building towards that. This is the time of Tomas de Torquemada as the Grand Inquisitor of Spain, and so it's called the Alhambra decree because it's signed, the Edict of Expulsion, by Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, in the Alhambra, that citadel and fortress at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in Granada, Spain. And on the right is a copy of the Edict of Expulsion. It is embossed with the royal seal. It is signed by the king and the queen and other officials. And all professing Jews and their descendants are expelled forevermore, again, from a land that they had lived in for 1,500 to 2,000 years. Now, how many Jews departed is still a matter of debate over 500 years later. On the traditional accounts, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews, even up to 800,000. More revisionist accounts seem to say there were maybe only 80,000 practicing Jews. Undoubtedly, there were hundreds of thousands of conversos or new Christians at this point. But the general consensus seems to be that whatever number we take, only half chose to leave to retain their Jewish identity. The other half or so converted to Catholicism under duress in order to stay in their ancestral homeland. And the final deadline for all Jews to leave Spanish territory, the dominions, was August 2nd, 1492, which corresponded to Tisha B'Av, right around it, 5252 on the Jewish calendar. And this sundered the unity of Sepharad. About half the exiles or so left the Iberian Peninsula entirely, went to North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Others actually remained on the Iberian Peninsula and entered the neighboring kingdom of Portugal. This was an abrupt cataclysm in Jewish history. Certainly for those who lived through it, there was nothing comparable to it. And it's sometimes been said that from the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE until the Holocaust, in our own living memory, again, this was the greatest catastrophe to befall the Jewish people. And this map shows where the exiles went. The red arrows are where the professing Jews from Spain went across the Mediterranean basin to North Africa, such as Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. Others, of course, went all the way across to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Egypt, to the land of Israel, up into Syria, and into the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, and to Izmir and Istanbul, where my own ancestors went. Others to Salonika or Thessaloniki, the great Greek port city, and others on and up into the Balkans, and others led by Don Isaac Abravanel, the famous biblical commentator, went to the Italian peninsula. And the black arrows represent where the Portuguese Jews, or as new Christians, went in later decades and centuries, again, principally to Western and Northern Europe, and eventually throughout the New World. But this really marks the moment, again, when the unity of Sepharad is torn apart. We have branches that start to emerge: North African Sephardim, Eastern, Western, B'nai Anusim, and of course conversos and Jews are all in this in some sense together. Now, the crucial point in Portuguese Jewish history is not 1492, but 1497. As I said, a number of Jews had entered Portugal hoping to find religious liberty or tolerance at the very least. And while it was initially granted, King Manuel I, who is seen here, he desired to wed the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of neighboring Spain. And as you can imagine, the precondition for the marital union was he had to expel the Jews from Portugal as well. He acquiesced, but he didn't want to lose, as he saw it, the business or political, intellectual acumen, their contributions they can make. So he forcibly converted the entire normative Portuguese Jewish community in spring 1497. And then he went further. He ordered all synagogues and schools to be closed, ritual objects, prayer books to be confiscated, even cemeteries to be uplifted. There was to be no memory of Judaism that remained. And in April of 1506, Finally, there was a massacre that erupted in the heart of Lisbon, in which 2,000 to 4,000 new Christians who were seen as Jews in all but name, they're slaughtered in the streets of Lisbon. Something the king very much opposed, but he wasn't present in the city at the time. For these collective series of actions by the Iberian monarchs, by Ferdinand and Isabella, by Manuel, this has been called a religiocide. Their total aim was to create a society free of Judaism. And if you think about it, perhaps it's not so drastic a step to envision not only a society free of Judaism, but of course, as we know in the 20th century, the Nazi project of creating a world free of Jews, religiocide to genocide. In the Iberian context, after 1492, 1497, the people of the book, a term, of course, normally applied to Jews, they became people of memory. No more synagogues, schools, books, study halls, rabbis. Judaism became an oral transmission of knowledge centered around the rituals of the home. Women increasingly became the teachers, traditional keepers, leaders of the domicile. And correspondingly, they became the intensified focus of inquisitorial scrutiny and investigation. And this is borne out in the inquisitorial records. In 1580, a dramatic event happened because the Iberian Union occurred. Spain and Portugal effectively merged into dynastic union, right? They became almost one kingdom, unified under the figure of Philip II of Spain, the same Philip who sent the Spanish Armada against Elizabeth I of England. And this is significant because the borders between Spain and Portugal opened, and the Portuguese New Christians who had been forbidden to leave were able to take advantage of this now borderless kingdom. They went into Spain and from there throughout Europe, the Middle East, and eventually to the New World. And so many left that eventually to find a Portuguese abroad outside of Portugal became synonymous with crypto-Jew, or as the term is, Judaizer, right? Secretly practicing Jewish rites and rituals. And the map shows, again, on the right, they went throughout the Mediterranean basin, in many cases rejoining their former co-religionists throughout, as you can see, in Italy or the Ottoman Empire. But others, of course, very famously went to Northern and Western Europe, to Hamburg, in Germany, to Amsterdam, of course, and eventually to London. And they, again, came to self-identify very strongly as the Homens do Nassau, as the members or the Hebrews of the Portuguese nation. It was an ethnic, almost an ethnic and national origin that bonded them wherever they went. Now in Amsterdam, the Portuguese New Christians arrived as early as the 1590s, but they didn't actually establish a formal community until well into the 1600s. The Sephardic community only unified in 1639. In 1648, massive massacres, attacks by Cossacks, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth compelled thousands of Ashkenazi Jews to flee. So they arrived in Amsterdam. And in 1675, the very nice and majestic Portuguese synagogue, the Synagoga, was dedicated. It still exists today. It just marked its 350th anniversary. And the building actually survived the Nazi occupation of Amsterdam. Alas, as in most other places, the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam almost did not, and 95% of them were murdered in Auschwitz. Now, for many new Christians, right, they had been kept at arm's length from normative rabbinic Judaism, right? They knew nothing, for example, of the Talmud. They didn't understand how, again, Judaism could differ in practice from what is seen in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And this could often spark conflict or tension when these new Christians arrived in normatively practicing or rabbinic Jewish communities. And one tragic example of this is Oriol Acosta, who was born in Portugal to a new Christian family. And he was made aware at an early age that he had Jewish ancestry. And he started to question Catholicism, and he eventually could take it no longer. And eventually he fled with his mother and brothers to Hamburg and then to Amsterdam. And he encountered rabbinic Judaism for the first time. And this struck him, it seems, as very much like the Catholic Church. He viewed it as corrupting the law of Moses, right, the original faith. And so he challenged rabbinic authority, some fundamental principles. He was excommunicated a few times. Eventually, he could bear the loneliness no longer. He sought to be reconciled. And as a precondition of it, he was forced to publicly stand in the synagogue. And this engraving or image is supposed to depict it, where he basically recanted his errors and then was symbolically lashed 39 times the biblical punishment of malchut. And then he was forced to lay on the ground, or the congregation walked over him. This was deeply humiliating. He went home. He finished writing his autobiography, Exemplar Humanae Vitae, Example of a Human Life, and he committed suicide. A younger contemporary, and one whose name is no doubt familiar to most, if not everyone here, is that of Baruch Spinoza, born in Amsterdam to Portuguese New Christians who had arrived in the city and reverted to Judaism before he was born. He, again, appears to have had a traditional Jewish education, but at an early age, he came to reject established Jewish beliefs, views truly revolutionary for the 17th century. And at the young age of 23, he was excommunicated. And it says, by decree of the angels and command of the holy men, we excommunicate, curse, and damn Baruch de Spinoza for abominable heresies and monstrous deeds. It doesn't explicitly detail what they were. It's still somewhat debated, but I think later on he wrote an actual work called Tractatus Theologico Politicus, his theological treatise that actually sheds great insight into what his views were. And again, how radical, how revolutionary they were for 17th century. He rejected the Mosaic authorship of the Hebrew Bible or the Pentateuch, the immortality of the soul, the binding nature of the Torah upon future generations. He even came, it seems, to somewhat identify God with the totality of creation, as he put it, Deus sive natura, God or nature. Now, unlike Oriel Acosta, he never sought to be reconciled to the Jewish community, but he never converted to Christianity. When doing so, would almost certainly have accelerated his success, his career, especially in academia. And so because he retained a kinship with the Jewish community through a common origin, but not by faith, he has sometimes been referred to as history's first secular Jew. And one of his teachers was Menashe ben Israel. Born as a Portuguese New Christian, Manuel Dias Soeiro, he moved to Amsterdam as a young boy, and by the mid-17th century, he became very famous. And parlaying his fame and his contacts in both the Jewish and non-Jewish worlds, he actually went to England, where he met with Oliver Cromwell. This is after the English Revolution, the overthrow of Charles I, the beheading of him, and Cromwell is ruling England as Lord Protector, right, in the 1650s in interregnum. And he actually met with Cromwell in the Council of State and petitioned to allow the Jews to be readmitted to England for the first time, since they had officially been expelled by King Edward I in 1290. And Cromwell was sympathetic to the petition, but he did not officially readmit Jews. However, he effectively turned a blind eye if they wished to come back. There are also, it appears, crypto-Jews already living there, perhaps not a surprise. In any event, this date of 1656 to 57 or so is marked as effectively the return, the resettlement of the Jewish community of London and the UK that endures to this day. And what's interesting is that because Cromwell never issued an official edict, there was nothing to be overturned when the restoration of the monarchy happened. King Charles II came to the throne in 1660, revoked Cromwell's edicts. But again, there was never an edict by Cromwell allowing the Jews to return. And so effectively it was a fait accompli. King Charles II permitted the Jews to stay. They established a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue that endures to this day. In 1663, even the noted diarist Samuel Pepys, who has a diary full of great insight into 17th century London, he visited the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, I believe, on Simchat Torah, rather raucous and rowdy day. Not sure it was the exact best day for him to visit, but he notes explicitly in his diary, in his writings, that they had a prayer for the king in Portuguese in homage to their Portuguese ancestry. The rest was in Hebrew. In 1701, the congregation moved to Bevis Marks Lane, to the street it still inhabits to this day, the only synagogue in Europe to have held continuous services for more than 300 years. And almost certainly the entire world. And a few years ago, I had the great honor to go to London, actually met with the rabbi in the synagogue. Now, transitioning across from Europe and the Ottoman Empire and Mediterranean world, crossing to the New World, across the Atlantic, we see again that new Christians, the Cristianos Nuevos in Spanish, or Cristianos Novos in Portuguese, right? They went as soon as the Spanish and Portuguese basically discovered, quote unquote, the New World, the Americas, and started colonization of these places. Now, Brazil came to be extremely significant because in 1630 or so, the Dutch conquered a portion of Portuguese Brazil, centered in the state of Pernambuco on the city of Recife on the northeastern coast. And they only held it for 24 years. But in this very brief period of time, a momentous change occurred because the Dutch governor, Johan Maurits, who's seen in this painting with the spectacular Van Dyck beard, he actually allowed the Jews to openly return to Judaism and to build a synagogue, which they did, Kahal Sor Israel, in 1636, the very first synagogue in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere. And so they came to actually have about 1,000 to 1,500 Jews. They were the same size as the Amsterdam-based Portuguese Jewish community. And so Amsterdam sent resources and personnel to assist in the growth of the community. And they actually sent Rabbi Isaac Aboab de Fonseca, whose image is here, who became the rabbi of Recife, Brazil, and he thus holds the distinction of being the first rabbi in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Well, the Portuguese in 1654 returned, they conquered Recife, and they gave the Dutch and the crypto Jews, who are now openly professing Jews, 3 months in which to leave. Where were they to go? Well, a number seems actually stayed in Brazil and just moved into the interior of the country or the continent known as the Sertão. Others returned to Amsterdam, including Rabbi Isaac Aboab. And he actually, a few years later, came to play a role in the excommunication of Spinoza. So an interesting connection there. And others, of course, famously island hop throughout the Caribbean to Dutch and English colonies, Barbados, Curacao, Dutch Guiana, or now known as Suriname, and Jamaica. And the most famous arrival story of the Jews in the future United States, with a direct connection to Recife, Brazil, is New York City. 23 Jews arrived in the then Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, and they sought to be admitted. Peter Stuyvesant, the Governor General, he asked the Dutch West India Company, which controlled the colony, not to admit Jews, calling them Christ killers and blasphemers, and he was overruled, ordered to admit them and to give them permission to live, trade, and travel, as long as they did not become a public charge. Whereupon they founded soon thereafter Congregation Shereth Israel, which again endures to this day. And this moment of the 23 arriving is widely viewed as the genesis or the birth of American Jewish history. But another origin story you may not be familiar with, but is also important, and I thought very interesting to share, is that of Savannah, Georgia. In February 1733, Georgia was created as the very last of the 13 colonies in British North America, and was founded by General James Oglethorpe. 5 months later, 41 Jews from London arrived. And it was comprised, interestingly, of 33 Portuguese Jews who were former conversos, and 8 Ashkenazi Jews, 2 families, the Shaftals and the Minuses. It was the largest group of Jews to arrive in colonial days, almost double the number of the 23 from Recife to New York. They brought with them a Sefer Torah scroll written on deerskin, dating from pre-1492 Iberia, the oldest in the United States, and a circumcision box. And when they arrived, they found the colony in the grip of epidemic, and the only physician, William Cox, had died. Well, fortunately, the Jews had a physician with them. Dr. Samuel Nunez, born in Lisbon as a Portuguese converso. He rose to become physician to the king and the Grand Inquisitor himself. He was jailed in the early 1700s on charges of Judaizing, which seems to be accurate. And in the 1720s, after somewhat managing to rehabilitate himself, he and his family fled to London, where they returned to normative Judaism. They had a normative Jewish marriage ceremony in Bevis Marks, and then it was he who halted or stopped the epidemic in Savannah in 1733, saving the colony. Nonetheless, the trustees in London informed Oglethorpe the Jews were not welcome to stay and ordered him to ban them. Oglethorpe defied them, not only allowed the Jews to stay, but actually distributed land grants on a completely equal basis, and is attested to in December 1733. And if you look at the names, they bear testament to the mixed Sephardi-Ashkenazi unity. Abraham Minus, Isaac Nunez Enriquez, Moses Ledesma, Samuel Nunez Ribeiro, Dr. Nunez, Benjamin Sheftel, Abraham Nunez Montesano. This is a picture I was privileged to take myself a few years ago of the original burying ground granted or gifted by General Oglethorpe to the Jewish community. And it said in the original charter of Georgia, Oglethorpe banned 4 things: slavery, rum, Catholics, and lawyers. When he left, 3 of the 4 were quickly overturned. The ban on Catholics was not lifted until after the American Revolution. And General Oglethorpe, right, had created Georgia to be a buffer zone between the Carolinas and Spanish Florida, right? Part of New Spain, technically under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. And so when the Spanish landed troops only 80 miles from Savannah, this sparked widespread alarm and panic. The Sephardic Jews, as former conversos, right, who had experienced the persecution of the Inquisition, the dungeons of the Inquisition firsthand, they fled. They feared the Inquisition would come and they would be burnt at the stake as apostates. And so they left, including Dr. Nunez, leaving only the 2 Ashkenazi families, the Sheftals and the Minuses, to maintain a Jewish presence. The community only returned in the 1770s, en masse during the time of the American Revolution, and the congregation Mikveh Israel in Savannah was chartered in 1790. In 1742, after the war ended, Oglethorpe returned to London, never again to return to the colony he had founded. But Oglethorpe lived to nearly 90 years old. He died in 1785. He witnessed the birth of the United States, and in fact, just a few weeks before he died, he personally met with John Adams, who was serving as America's ambassador to London. And Adams tells us that Oglethorpe expressed great esteem and regard for the emerging American Republic, which built on his own impressive legacy of religious tolerance or liberty, particularly for Jews. Today, the Congregation Mikveh Israel in Savannah is the 3rd oldest in the United States, the oldest in the American South. They still proudly retain the 15th century Torah scroll written on deerskin. And a few years ago, I also had the honor to be the guest speaker at their 290th anniversary. And if you see right next to me on this table with the blue tablecloth, underneath the Talit scroll is that 600-year-old Torah scroll written on deerskin. And so following in this, we had, of course, a whole range of Spanish and Portuguese synagogues established from Recife, Brazil, throughout the Caribbean, up the eastern seaboard to Montreal, Canada. And the names of all these synagogues in Hebrew evoke a yearning for redemption, for salvation from persecution. They're all variants of the names Remnant, Hope, Dispersed, or Salvation of Israel. And so as the academic Studiment Halevi has noted, this was an extraordinary global circuit, right, that literally went around the world. Went from the Caribbean to the Atlantic, to Europe, to the ancestral Iberian Peninsula, to even Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Africa and Asia. And it really created these multiple and intersecting networks underpinning the capacity to cross religious, political, and cultural divides. Now, the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions that we talked about, right, were extremely cognizant of this global migration of the conversos, right, of new Christians, of people they viewed, of course, as being heretics. And so they established subsidiary tribunals in their colonies around the world, in Mexico City, right, in Peru, in Colombia. That's where the Spanish established their tribunals. The Portuguese established a tribunal in Goa, India, to oversee Portugal's colonies in Africa and Asia. And they empowered the Bishop of Bahia, the capital of Portuguese Brazil, to identify and extradite the suspects back to Lisbon to stand trial. And looking at just a few of these case studies, in Goa, the Inquisition, as you see, was established in 1560 and lasted until 1812. An extraordinary time. 1510, Afonso de Albuquerque conquered the city. And by the way, the Portuguese ruled Goa until 1961. So conversos, when they were allowed to leave Portugal, they fled, of course, and wanted to get as far away from possible as the Inquisition, and many actually came to India. Right, there were pre-existing Jewish communities, international trade, something they had been a part of. They went to escape scrutiny. Well, in 1546, Francis Xavier, a Jesuit missionary, arrived and was so shocked to see so many conversos openly practicing Judaism, he sent a letter to the Portuguese king imploring him to establish an inquisition in Goa. And that came in 1560. And this Goa Inquisition came to target not just crypto Jews, though that was, of course, a part of it, but heretics from all religious cultures: Jews, Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Christians. In fact, it even led the fanaticism, the ferocity of Goa's tribunal, led even the French philosopher Voltaire to comment, "Goa is famous for its Inquisition. The Portuguese monks made us believe that the people worship the devil, while it is they who have served him." In Peru, the first Inquisition in the Americas, that came in 1570 and lasted till 1820, so 2.5 centuries. And the zenith, though, as you can see, of the persecution came around the time of the great influx of Portuguese, right, in the 1630s. And remember, Portuguese outside of Portugal is seen to be equivalent to crypto-Jew or Judaizer. So as one contemporary, Don Leon de Alcayaga, notes, and if you can see it in the Spanish, de 6 a 8 años a este parte, es muy grande la cantidad de portuguesas que ha entrado en este reino del Perú, donde antes había muchos. For the past 6 to 8 years, a great number of Portuguese Jews have entered the kingdom of Peru, and there were a great number already there. And this led to the so-called Great Conspiracy, Gran Complicidad, in which over 100 conversos were arrested and purged from society. Among them were the individuals Manuel Bautista Perez, a merchant and the wealthiest man in the colony. So he died in penitence, so his estate was confiscated. And Francisco Maldonado de Silva, a Jewish physician, imprisoned for nearly a decade. Facing the flames, he declared, "This is the doing of the God of Israel, so I may look upon him face to face." And an auto de fe was held a few years later in 1639, they say burning 12 at the stake. In Mexico, established the year after Peru, the largest auto de fe ever staged in the history of Mexico or New Spain occurred in 1649. Over 100 people were accused of practicing crypto-Judaism. 57 people who died had their bones exhumed to be burnt, to show that even in death, one cannot escape the reach of the inquisitors. We know that several people were relaxed, the euphemism for being handed over to secular authorities to be burnt at the stake. One individual, Tomas Trevino de Subramante, refused to recant his errors. He resolved to die in the law of Moses, and he was burnt alive at the stake. We know that people came from over 50 miles to witness this spectacle. And this is the site of the headquarters in Mexico City today. And if you read the Spanish, it says this is the place, este lugar, the quemadero, the burning place of the Inquisition. But the most famous story associated with the Mexican Inquisition is that of the Carvajal family, situated around Nuevo León or Monterrey, Mexico. Luis de Carvajal, the elder, was a conquistador and appointed by Philip II to become governor of that Nuevo León province. He invited family members to join him. Many of them were secretly crypto-Jews, led by his nephew of the same name, so Luis de Carvajal the Younger, nicknamed El Mozo. In 1589 or so, he was arrested after being denounced. El Mozo tortured and named a number of accomplices of a small crypto-Jewish community. Eventually, he was reintegrated. He had to do certain penance, and he was denounced a second time, and there was to be no escape. He did manage to write a very significant document, which is a little diary detailing his beliefs, his practices, which actually also provides insight into life in colonial Mexico. And that still survives today in Mexico City in the archives. And in 1596, he and his family were burnt in the auto de fe in Mexico City. And lastly, we have Isaac de Castro Tardis, who went to Dutch Brazil, right? We talked about Recife, Brazil, this where Jews could openly worship. For some unknown reason, he ventured into the Portuguese part of Brazil, was apprehended, identified as Jewish, extradited to Lisbon. He is said to have made a masterful defense not only of Judaism, but of the principle of liberty of conscience. This matter not, he was burnt at the stake in the great Torero do Pazo, in the Praça de Comercial Square, as you can see here. And numerous attestations tell us he died saying the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And his defiance inspired the populace so much that the Shema itself appears to have been placed under interdict. No non-Jew even could say it. The inquisitors watched for it in the days after. And so altogether, it seems in some sense the Inquisition defeated its own purpose. Yes, it had played a role, right, with the monarchs in expelling Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, but it did not expel Judaism. It mutated, it changed, it went underground. As Dalia Candioti in the Converso's Return notes, drawing on Sartre's argument, it's anti-Semitism that creates the Jew, Solange O'Barrow has asserted that the Inquisition created crypto-Jews through constantly reminding them of their Jewish heritage. Likewise, Toby Green, in his book, Inquisition and the Reign of Fear, says that far from eradicating heresy, persecution only cemented the bonds, played a key role in ensuring that the conversos, the new Christians, continue to identify, right, and to remain connected to one another. In his magnificent tome, Secrecy and Deceit, the late David Gitlitz, he wrote and inquired into what were the beliefs of the crypto Jews. And it's actually not so easy as you might think, because beliefs change over time, right? They're never the same from place to place, or time to time. And he says, before we can even examine what it meant to be a converso, right, we have to admit, what does it mean to be Jewish? Because, as we know, that's not so simple. And Gitlitz identified 5 different definitions over the course of time. There is the biological definition, that a Jew is someone according to traditional halakha, whose parents or mother is Jewish. We have a belief, a Jew believes certain core ideas. Practice, a Jew does key rituals. We have self-conception or self-actualization. Someone chooses to identify with the Jewish people, to belong with them. In my heart, I lit the candles on Friday night. In my heart, I didn't fast. In my heart, I didn't look at the crucifix, so on and so forth. And the last is that definition imposed by the external society, by the outside tormentor, whether in the time of the Inquisition or the Holocaust. They define who a Jew is. And at that point, personal belief and practice fade away. So bearing these definitions in mind, we can look at the taxonomy, right, of conversos or new Christians. You can see it runs the spectrum. On the one side, we have assimilators who became genuine Catholics, very fervent, identified with this new faith, or Christian reformers. And on the other side, we have the crypto Jews, right, those who became Judaizers, who really tried to hold on to their ancestral faith, though of course that would change over time, again, as they didn't have access to books, to rabbis, etc. And then in the middle, right, you have those who became syncretistic, right, amalgamating various traditions of both Judaism and Christianity. We have those who vacillated, went back and forth, never really knowing which religion to believe in. And then you have the smaller group, or the skeptics, again, such as Acosta, Spinoza, those who not only came to reject maybe both religions, but even the concept of a theistic deity, right? They became to believe in a deistic deity, or again, a God who maybe not even played no role, but there's a very few cases where it seems they came to believe in no God. So it really runs the gamut. But of the crypto Jews, the ones who try to keep identifying as Jewish, Gitlitz, after scouring thousands of inquisitorial records in Spain, Portugal, and their overseas empires, he came to call them Catholics without faith and Jews without knowledge. And they held on to these 5 key principles, it seems, even in the absence of all else. Though, of course, it probably again changes somewhat from time to time, place to place, but this is probably a good understanding. The unity of the deity, they did not believe in the conception as espoused in Catholicism, a belief in the law of Moses, that it was still intact. A third was that belief was good, but observance of commandments was also important. The fourth is that there may be different paths to salvation, but Judaism was the preferred faith. And lastly, the Messiah has not yet come. So with all this going on, right, the Inquisition came to be the subject of condemnation, right, as we go into the 17th and 18th century, right, with the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, the time of the American and French revolutions, right, looking at interrelated conceptions of God, reason, nature, and man, and a belief that this could lead to greater human happiness, human unity. And this sparked intellectual and policy debates across the continent, with increasing calls for respect of dissenters and liberty of conscience. And some of the individuals are those we have named already who were involved in this debates, of John Locke of England, Baruch Spinoza of the Netherlands, David Hume in Scotland. I was able to visit his tomb and statue in Edinburgh some years ago, and the philosophers Voltaire and Montesquieu in France. And really, Montesquieu in his great work, The Spirit of Laws, I think expressed many people's abhorrence of the Inquisition and what future generations would look back on. He says in his 1748 to the inquisitors, "If anyone in times to come shall dare to assert that in the age in which we live, the people of Europe were civilized, you will be cited to prove that they were barbarians. And the idea they will have of you will dishonor your age." And marked changes eventually even came to the Iberian Peninsula itself. This is in Portugal, and this is an image of the Marquês de Pombal, who served effectively as the prime minister for a quarter of a century. He was a direct contemporary in the late 18th century with the founders of the United States. He tried to abolish the Inquisition as a devotee of the Enlightenment, and he was not successful. But he did manage to halt a lot of its excesses and abuses, and finally remove secrecy of procedure, allowing the witnesses to finally know the identity of their accusers and the details of the alleged crime, or the time and the place. And all this came to bear and have an influence on the fledgling United States, particularly the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, authored by Thomas Jefferson, passed by the Virginia General Assembly in 1786. Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, this landmark document begins, no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship. All men shall be free to profess their opinions in matters of religion. And this was so important to Jefferson that an excerpt of it's actually inscribed on the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. And you can actually see a picture of me pointing up to it inside. And following the passage of this bill in the Assembly, Madison wrote to Jefferson, who was serving as U.S. ambassador to France, I flatter myself that we have in this country extinguished forever the ambitious project of making laws for the human mind. And this leads, of course, to perhaps one of the greatest symbolic shows of Jewish integration into society, the liberty of conscience in early America, the early American Republic. And this is the figure of Gershom Antisacius, the spiritual leader of Congregation Shereth Israel, right? That was created by the 23 Jews from Recife, Brazil in 1654. Satius actually participated alongside other clergy in offering a benediction for George Washington's first inauguration in New York City in April 1789. And Satius's own grandfather was a converso who had fled the Portuguese Inquisition. And Satius's brother, Moses, was the president of the warden of the Toro Synagogue in Newport, that of course received the most famous letter, the greatest articulation of religious liberty ever written by George Washington. But Satius wrote the first letter to Washington. And as he put it, permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you. Deprived as we have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now behold a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but affords to all liberty of conscience. Again, this is someone writing whose own grandfather had fled the fires of the Inquisition. This is not something remote. It's not something abstract. This was real. This was lived. And Washington's famous response, largely paraphrasing Satius, but then adding in a blessing. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, for religious freedom is an inherent natural right. The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, and again, as you may know the famous line at the end, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants. Everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree. There shall be none to make him afraid. And the founders knew that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, and they have various procedural guarantees in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to guard against the establishment of an inquisition from ever coming to American soil. And of course, in the First Amendment, above all, is liberty or freedom of conscience in religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. The Fifth Amendment guarantees the right to remain silent and due process of law. The Sixth Amendment is the right to defense counsel, a speedy public trial, confront witnesses against you, and the Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And so with this long history, this long era came to an end already by the late or early 19th century. See, in 1821, the Portuguese Inquisition was finally abolished. Again, only 200 years ago. July 4th, 1826, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died. On July 4th, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, 3 weeks later, in Spain, the last victim of the Inquisition was executed. Thomas Jefferson, who did so much to combat religious intolerance, who authored that Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, did not live to see the end of the Inquisition. In 1834, the Spanish Inquisition was officially abolished. And in 1836, the last living founder, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, the author of the Bill of Rights, died, ending this age, again, of the founders, of those who drafted the Constitution and the Declaration, and of course, the age of the Inquisition itself. The geographical and generational scope of persecution of the Inquisition was utterly unprecedented until the Holocaust. As you can see, it encompassed 5 continents and lasted for nearly 350 years. We're talking 10 to 12 generations of the same family coming under inquisitorial suspicion. The Inquisition had a presence in virtually every ocean. There's, again, nothing like it. And it truly remains mind-boggling how many thousands of miles people were brought about across oceans and continents and mountain ranges to justify their religious beliefs. What are the final numbers of the Inquisition? Very hard to say with certainty. Francisco Bethencourt has advanced the idea that perhaps 200,000 people stood trial before the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions over the duration of their long lifetime. Again, obviously not all crypto-Jews, but crypto-Jews were the very first part of the persecution, and they remained so in a sense throughout. Anytime the Inquisition did not know what the ideology was, anytime they felt threatened, they revert to, this must be secret Jews. The Jews are behind this. Even if short of a formal trial, the number of people who were denounced and hauled before the tribunal also appears, it's astonishing. It rises to 1.5 million people. But we don't know the real number and likely never will. And in some sense, it matters not, because we cannot compute the sum of human misery. I'd like to end by looking at two brief crypto-Jewish case studies that continued into the present day, into our time, and also just they're important because they were on the Iberian Peninsula itself in the eye of the hurricane. The first is the island of Majorca, off the coast of Spain, the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean. In 1435, the entire Jewish community had been converted en masse to Catholicism, and in 1488, the Inquisition arrived, while the last survivors of that generation were alive. Over the next half century, over 1,000 people were tried, many were penanced, others were burnt in effigy, and a number were burnt at the stake. The Inquisition seems to have gone relatively dormant, and as you can see, from 1545 to 1673, they actually maintained contact with Jewish communities in Italy. This is an interesting map, because where did these crypto-Jews, or the people who were targeted by the Inquisition here, they came to be known as Shuetas, derogatory term also somewhat akin to Marrano. They lived in between the church and the headquarters of the Inquisition, right under their very noses. The Inquisition returned with a vengeance in the late 17th century. Hundreds of crypto-Jews were condemned and penanced at an auto da fe in a period known as the Cremadissa, the mass burnings. And the largest act of faith, or auto da fe, in the history of the Balearic Islands occurred in 1691, when 37 people were relaxed. So again, the euphemism for being handed over to the secular authorities to be burnt at the stake. 3 were burnt alive. Raphael Valls, the spiritual leader of the community, Catalina Tarangui and her brother Rafael Tarangui, and this bonfire of the Jews, as it was called, was witnessed by 30,000 people in Palma de Mallorca. In 2011, on the 320th anniversary, the Balearic Islands apologized for the bonfire of the Jews. And this is a picture of the regional president shaking hands with Rabbi Yosef Wallace, a direct descendant of Raphael Valls, and Rabbi Nissim ben Avraham, a descendant of Catalina Tarangui. That same year, the 18,000 descendants of the Shuetas were recognized as Jewish by Rabbi Nissim Karlitz in Israel, a nephew of the Chazon Ish. And in 2018, the Balearic Islands installed a memorial plaque outside the place wherein occurred the bonfire of the Jews. And the last other example is that of Belmonte in Portugal, that you may be familiar with, you may have heard of. This acquired somewhat famous acclaim. A Jewish community was founded in the 13th century, but the story that we're looking at really began in 1917 in the midst of World War I, when Samuel Schwartz, a Polish Jewish engineer who's seen here, went to Portugal for work. And while there, he encountered an individual, Baltazar Pereira de Souza, who said that his family secretly practiced Jewish rituals. And when Schwartz said that he was Jewish, de Souza didn't believe him. Schwartz didn't believe him. So de Souza decided to take him to the village. And he brought him to the old women, the Rezaderas, who were the guardians of the tradition. In crypto-Judaism, the women were the leaders. And the only identifying statement that he made that they accepted was the Shema. At the name of God, Hashem, Adonai, the old woman covered her face and said, he knows the name of our Lord. He is one of us. The Jews of Belmonte, to a large extent, believed they were among the last surviving Jews on the planet. And Schwartz was welcomed into the community and proceeded to write a book detailing the rituals and beliefs of the new Christians in 1925. And we know that circumcision was too dangerous to perform because it was so overt, and anyone could see it. If of course, if the conditions were ripe. Prayers changed over time. Only a remnant of Hebrew was left. They did observe Shabbat. They lit candles on Friday nights in hidden places, in cupboards or hidden closets so people couldn't see. They did bake matzahs for Passover in secret. But they, of course, didn't have access to a Jewish calendar. They held the Seder on a different date, commemorating the Exodus to throw inquisitors off the scent. And above all, they venerated fasting over feasting, and particularly the holidays of Yom Kippur and the fast of Esther. Why? Because to them, Queen Esther was a crypto-Jew herself. Had she not been commanded by Mordecai to not reveal her people or kindred, right, in the holiday of Purim until the time was right. And when she went to implore, right, salvation for the Jewish people, she asked them to fast for 3 days, and then she would go unto the king. And by the way, this is, of course, the traditional tomb of Mordecai and Esther in Iran, in Hamdan. And this is a picture of the chief rabbi reading the Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, at the tomb of Esther during the COVID Purim. The fast of Esther eventually became transformed into the festival of Santa Hysterica. Queen Esther became known as the patron saint, and the women, taking her words literally, fasted for 3 days around the clock, viewing it as a symbol of martyrdom and a source of strength to perpetuate this crypto-Jewish identity. They also seemed to believe it was a type of atonement for the sin of living a double life, and they thought it could hasten the coming of the Messiah. Once news of this broke, a very Portuguese army officer, Arthur Carlos de Barros Basto, he went to these far-flung places near the city of Porto in the north. He made Herculean efforts to reintegrate them into the community, into mainstream or normative Jewish society. Eventually, he was tarred with false allegations and unceremoniously dismissed from the Portuguese army, thus becoming known as the Portuguese Dreyfus. The Jewish community of Porto produced a film in 2019 entitled Sepharad, detailing the efforts of Captain Barros Basto. And a few years ago, I actually went to Porto and got to meet the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of Barros Basto at their main synagogue. And the community was officially recognized in 1990. They built a synagogue, and they put a plaque that says, "The chain of our tradition has not been severed." As a result of government decrees, the Jewish residents were forced to publicly deny their Judaism, but they maintained it in their homes. Here, the Jewish soul was never lost. Here, it remains forever. They built a museum in 2005, and the municipality inaugurated a square named for Samuel Schwartz in 2019 for the man who had done so much to broadcast the consciousness to the world. The legacy also lives on in DNA. An interesting study from 2008, looking at the Y chromosome of 1,000 men from the Iberian Peninsula, showcased that about 20% have Sephardic ancestry, a testament to a longstanding Jewish presence, and of course, unfortunately, to forced conversions over many places and times. A more groundbreaking study in 2018, looking at Latin America, found that up to 25% have Sephardic ancestry. So if you take into account these numbers, if you have 650 million people in Latin America, 60 million Latinos or Hispanics in the United States, 20% of modern-day Iberian men, not even looking at women, who descend from Sephardic Jews, it is conceivable, plausible mathematically, that up to 200 million people around the globe descend from Sephardic Jews. Whatever the point is and however they identify, this is part of the story of the Jewish people. They are Zerah Yisrael, from the seed of Israel. And so in conclusion, this is a photo of the Plaza Mayor of Madrid that I took when I visited. And of course, if you see it, looking very much at Rizzi's painting in the Prado, the same apartments, the same balconies are still present a few hundred years later, and people come and they eat and drink and have a very good time. And how many people are cognizant of the immense horrors and atrocities that occurred in this place again a few hundred years earlier? In Lisbon, on the site of that 1506 massacre of the New Christians, there is a monument to the murdered Jews of Lisbon, victims of religious intolerance and fanaticism, in the spot where it occurred. And this was done in 2006 on the 500th anniversary. What is the enduring legacy of the Inquisition? Well, of course, it created secret Jews, hidden Jews, crypto Jews that we are still engaging with and seeing, of course, coming out, returning many cases from all quarters of the globe. But the Inquisition exported intolerance, right, and drastically remade our world. The unity of Sephardic Jews was torn asunder. It has never been repaired. It never probably can be. The Inquisitions were abolished only 200 years ago, and the 1492 Edict of Expulsion of Spain was officially revoked only in 1968. To end with the words of the late Professor Cecil Roth, a great historian at Oxford University, the editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia Judaica, crypto-Judaism, in one form or another, as he puts it in his book, A History of the Marranos, is as old as the Jew himself. That is the legacy for today, and it's something that will be with us for all generations to come. Thank you very much. Hope you found it interesting, informative, educational. I look forward to questions or comments.
Thank you so much for that, Isaac. That was a wonderful presentation. If anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand physically, or with the raise hand button, you can put your questions in the chat and we'll look for your hands. Howard, I see your hand.
I go?
Yeah.
Can you comment on the relationship of the crypto Jews to the Shabbatean movement?
Yeah, so you know, it's that's actually not my Sabbatianism is not my forte or my expertise, but I mean there might very well be a connection. I mean, I've read the work, the landmark, work by Gershom Shalom on Shabbatai Tzvi. I don't know if you have, but he.
Part of it.
Okay, so he actually says, and he quotes some places that it does appear to be, again, of course, I could let Yitzhak, Professor Yitzhak Karam speak on this, but he does seem to indicate that there were a number of Portuguese and Christians who had arrived in Izmir and other parts of the Ottoman Empire that did become among the most stalwart supporters of Shabbatai Tzvi. But that also being said, as Professor Karam mentioned, right, so those who converted, right, to Sabbatianism or to Islam officially and then practice in secret, they are a form of crypto Jews themselves, the Don Meh, because they are still self-defining, self-identifying as Jewish to a large extent. So they are part of the story, but again, it's a completely, but it's not exactly this, but it is related. But yeah, I'm sorry I can't answer you in any more depth, but
thank you.
Yeah.
I see in the chat that Rachel asked if we could put the word in the chat that was
You
being
did.
asked.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
Yitzhak did. I
Okay.
just didn't understand. I need
Oh,
to see it printed.
Sabbatians? Yeah.
Yeah, but didn't you say it a little bit differently than that?
Well, there's another word, which is Don Meh, Donmeh. These are the ones, the followers of Shabbatai Tzvi who converted to Islam, followed in his wake, but still practiced, some version of Judaism as they understood it. So Don Meh, you could look it up. That there's actually a recent book, I believe, released that tries to investigate their beliefs and in greater detail. Donmeh.
Thank you.
Anna, I see your hand up. You're muted. Anna, you're muted.
So what I'm wondering is, you did mention how some smaller places where the Inquisition was and what's happening there today. But I'm wondering about Spain itself. Now, how does Spain, modern day Spain, regard the Inquisition? Was much longer ago than, Germany and Nazism, but we know that Germany kind of atoned in a number of ways, and what the attitude is, in modern day Germany towards Hitler and Nazism and the Holocaust. But what about Spain? I just read about the rise of anti-Semitism there, and I'm just wondering what the view is, if any, towards the Inquisition, which, began there. And the other little thing is just a comment, because you showed us a map and how the Inquisition spread everywhere, but it was all Catholic countries, you know. At some point, Martin Luther came around, and there were a lot of Protestant countries, and it was not happening there. I just wanted to make that comment. So I was just wondering about modern day Spain. And I don't know, do they even have it in their history books?
So I don't know exactly the what modern day curricula in Spain are doing. I mean, I do have some relatives there who live in the South. They do say it's, especially since post October 7th, it has not been, unfortunately, a particularly hospitable place. Now, you do know, right? We do know there was the attempt, as many people viewed it, as a type of compensation, preparation to pass that, the citizenship opportunities for descendants of Sephardic Jews, or those impacted by the Inquisition or the expulsion, to kind of reclaim Sephardic citizenship. But I don't think they anticipated the sheer number of applications. And then, of course, they ended the program, and there's been a lot of bad blood. I know a lot of diasporic Sephardic communities, of course, were very upset with how they were treated. And in many cases, I can also tell you, I believe that people who are descendants of conversos felt that they particularly were kind of shunted aside, that they were, even though they could rely on inquisitorial documents to prove their ancestors had been persecuted in the first place. So I don't know specifically how Spain deals with it, but in my few times I've been there, I can say that people have heard of it, but they don't know details. Even when I went into the Plaza Mayor, even with a special tour guide, she showed me something. She says the schools don't really go into detail, and on top of it, because the ruling family, the Bourbon royal family, for example, are descendants of Ferdinand and Isabella. I mean, they can never fully admit, right, that there was a mistake that was made. They can maybe apologize for some of the excesses or the abuses, but they will never fully acknowledge, to the extent, say, that Germany has with the Holocaust, this same type of how could we have done this, because it was justified, from a religious point of view for many of them. So that's in terms of Spain. And Martin Luther, you're absolutely right. The Inquisition is a Catholic phenomenon. Of course, Martin Luther speaks very harshly about Jews later on. And
But
yes,
it's not an Inquisition.
correct. It's not. This is all done authorized by the papacy. And then in Spain and Portugal, of course, given to royal control. Maybe at some points, it's true the papacy actually tried to restrict the power, but once it was given, it was too late. And this is always the problem with institutions. They last longer than we intend. And of course, they would have an extraordinary life. And in many cases, again, I think the legacy continues today. In fact, even the Roman Inquisition technically still exists because they changed to the doctrine of the faith. So yeah, these things are very much with us.
So it's true what you said about all these people that may have Jewish blood. A good friend of mine is married to a Spaniard, and he often speaks about that there are many people somehow on the borders or near the ocean in Spain, that there are many people that are not uncertain whether their ancestry were Marranos or not. I mean, that still goes on there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a large number. As I said, the DNA shows even just among men how widespread it is. I mean, we know that Jews were well integrated, obviously represented. It was the largest Jewish community in the world. So I'm sure the numbers are probably even higher. I mean, someone told me in Portugal they were extremely philo-Semitic because they all know that, a lot, they have some type of Jewish ancestry, no matter how remote it is. Though I think it's been somewhat challenged in the post-October 7th era. Unfortunately, Portugal, like everywhere else, has not escaped, the rise of anti-Semitism. But yes, it's very much a part, obviously, of all these societies, particularly the Iberian Peninsula, and it always will be.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we have some questions in the chat. I'm going to read the first one from Andrea. What is the percentage of Sephardic Jews as opposed to Ashkenazic Jews in the world, and have their cultures been merged at all?
So it's a good question. So I think we have about 15 million Jews in the world, give or take. you know, you have Sephardic Jews from Spain and Portugal. You also have then again these Mizrahi Jews, right? So the Jews, say, from North Africa or the Middle East, who don't necessarily have a connection to Spain or Portugal, but then many people consider them Sephardic, right? Because of this merger after 1492, when you have a lot of intermarriage and kind of this merger. I'd say just a few million people, maybe 3 million, maybe Sephardic Jews. So it's the Ashkenazim are the vast majority of the world's Jewish community, maybe 70, 75%. If I had to take a guess, the rest are, you know, Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews. So that's kind of where we stand now. Again, I'm open to being corrected, again, depending, I think, on how we define. And yes, I think you also mentioned, Kathy, or you asked about, you know, what do you say, are they joining together? Yeah, I think so, to a large extent. I mean, my own family, my dad's Sephardic, my mom's Ashkenazi. So I had one set of grandparents who spoke Yiddish, and of course, one set speaking Ladino. And my grandmother was from Istanbul, my grandfather, and my grandmother from Aleppo speaking Arabic. And my grandparents spoke in French together on that side. So the Passover table, you could hear all those all those languages. I hope that answers the other question. Yeah.
So we have a few more questions in the chat, and Dolly and Howard, I do see your hand up. I'm going to read one more from the chat, and then we'll go to you guys. What was the status of kashrut among conversos, given the predominance of pork and ham in Iberian cuisine? Were people aware of not eating pork?
So that's also a great point. This is, you know, because the Inquisition knew that Jews and Muslims don't eat pork. So if you were a former Jew or descendant of Jews, this is often cited as one of the reasons why you come under investigation in the Inquisition, because you don't eat pork. This is why they create sometimes, you know, I think chicken that tries to resemble pork, at least superficially, or from a distance. So it could look like it looks like you're eating. Others, of course, people had to, you know, they felt they had to preserve their lives, and I don't blame them for that. And you go ahead and you eat the pork, right? And then it just becomes a part of the staple. I mean, of you have to do what you have to do in order to survive. Of course, conversely, it's interesting that if you eat too much pork, that can also draw attention. Like, why are you eating so much? It must be to offset the fact that you're secretly, you know, practicing Jewish rituals and traditions. So in many cases, it's like, it's not, you know, it's not a win-win. There's no way to win this, right? The Inquisition's going to investigate you. You're probably going to be penanced. You may not very well be executed, but you're going to be under suspicion for a long time, you and your family.
Dolly and Howard?
Yeah, so this relates to the Protestant versus Catholic thing, but it certainly didn't seem to be uniform attitudes among the Protestants. So things like when Stuyvesant in New York wanted to say, no, don't admit the Jews, and the, I guess, Dutch East India, I'm sorry, I got that wrong, said, no, we want that. What is known about why they felt that way, and what they said? What did they see as the reason to say, no, we do want them?
So for Stuyvesant refusing to, or not wanting them to come in?
No, the other side that overruled him and wouldn't agree to that.
So
want to admit that.
I see. Okay, so I think in this case it's because the Dutch West India Company controlled the colony. I don't know the exact numbers, but there are, of course, a very influential Jewish community in Amsterdam, Portuguese Jews. Their own brethren are trying to effectively find a place, and so there's only 23 of them, and they prevailed in persuading the Dutch West Company to allow them to open the doors.
So it was the influence of an attitude towards Jews in Amsterdam that,
I think that played a role, and also just, I think, because the argument could be made that Jews in many cases, because they form part of this international kind of, you know, community, they can be very good for business and trading. So it's not along the lines of religious liberty. It's just, we don't really care what they're worshiping or practicing, You know, I mean, Stuyvesant at least was devout. He just didn't like anything that wasn't Calvinist. It's not only Jews. He says if we admit Jews, we have to admit Catholics. We have to admit all these other Christian denominations. So, you know, the Jews are the canary in the coal mine, even there. But yeah, it's interesting. What I do think I'll just add on that is that Oglethorpe, by contrast, in Georgia, to me, what I've read and everything seems to be much more of a religious kind of like a religious liberty, a religious that he thought the Jews could out of course something and, you know, contribute to the economy. But I think he felt a genuine debt to Dr. Nunez. And Oglethorpe was a man in advance of his time because, again, he did abolish slavery. He was friends with the Native Americans in his time. In fact, he actually, when he returned to England, he brought one of the Native American leaders with him. And he even introduced him to King George II, I believe, at the time. And when he died, Oglethorpe actually built a monument to him. So the very first monument in Savannah is to a Native American, to a person of color. It's no longer extant; it's not there. But Oglethorpe, I think, in many ways, was a man ahead of his time, as opposed to it wasn't for purely utilitarian or economic considerations.
Question. Can you hear me?
Yes, Andrea.
Oh, I'm sorry. What's Mizrahi? Maybe I missed it. Maybe it was in the beginning here.
So Mizrahi are basically Jews who've lived in the Middle East and North Africa. So they're not from Spain or Portugal. They're not Ashkenazi Jews, right? So they are more of these Jews who've been for centuries or millennia living, again, Middle East, North Africa, Iraq, right? Syria, Yemen. I mean, all the way in Mizrahi itself, there was a very broad term because it encompasses so many diverse Jewish communities within itself. I mean, Moroccan Jews are their thing, Turkish Jews are Yemenite Jews are their thing, Syrian Jews, Iranian Jews, right? Persian Jews. I mean, they're all but they're kind of under this rubric of they're not really, they're certainly not Ashkenazi. They're not Sephardi because they don't have a direct connection, say, to Spain or Portugal. Although in many cases there is, again, that intermarriage or intermixture after 1492. But again, the Jews who just were living there, basically indigenous to Middle East and North Africa, living there for centuries, and the ones who basically are largely ethnically cleansed and expelled post 1948.
Let me ask you, in Israel, is there still that tension? You know, for many years there was a lot of tension, and they weren't treated as well as the Ashkenazi. That's still happening, or?
So that's a great question. I do know the tension in the Ma'abarot and the lack of, but I'm not Israeli and I haven't been to Israel in a long time. I don't know to what extent the tension still exists, but do you know, as you know, that Israel is over 50%. It is over 50% Sephardic Mizrahi at this time, but Professor Karam says tension is more than ever. So it's still there.
Shame.
Just to respect Isaac's time, let's have just a couple more questions, and then we will proceed to unstructured chat time. Thank you.
Jude, you have a question?
Yeah, it's not a question. It's just a quick comment that a cousin did the 23andMe, and both sides of my family were, Eastern European, Ashkenazi. And so the cousin said, guess what? We have 5% Sephardic, and it would be wonderful if we could trace how that happened because there's no awareness. But for some reason we thought that was very cool. Like, hey, we got 5% Sephardic, I don't know. It seems to be that take on it. But I have no clue how we would find out where that came from, which would be a fascinating piece of information,
It's true. I mean, this is a question I've faced before too, and it's one I'm sure it's coming up frequently, increasingly, is, how many Sephardic Jews made their way to Eastern Europe? This is a question. I mean, I don't know, and I can't really give any facts, myself, but what I have heard really are that there are Jews who actually, because they go all the way into the Balkans, up into the former Yugoslavia, even Romania, someone told me there are graves of Sephardic Jews already, say in Prague, in the 1500s. You have Sephardic names already appearing that are still extant today, and maybe crossed into Poland or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Even a colleague in Poland told me that he could show me sometime. It's like there. So they came as early, as the 1500s. So it's possible, but again, I don't know a certain way to prove it with certainty. The only other thing I could say is that there are some Hasidic dynasties, that claim descent, and because they can keep, I think, fairly good, meticulous record keeping, like royalty, it's easier for them to try to show they had some ancestor who made his way over and eventually adopted Ashkenazi, liturgy, customs, traditions. But unfortunately, yeah, it's hard to prove.
Yeah. No, and because my grandfather was from Poland, Russia, and on the other side, Kiev, which was Kiev then,
Right.
and all that. And by the way, so thank you very much. It was so fascinating and so much I didn't know that now I would have to go over again to let it sink in, all the information. Thank you very much for tonight.
Thank you. Yeah.
We have one other question that was in the chat from Andrea. She says, I hear that many people who have converso background are discovering their Jewish ancestry and going through formal conversions back to Judaism. What is the percentage of people doing that?
Well, that's a very good question. I can't tell you, unfortunately, with any certainty what exactly. I mean, anecdotally, I hear about it quite a bit. I mean, I hear, of course, the American Southwest, the Rio Grande Valley, have El Paso, Juarez, but I even hear, in the Philippines or Indonesia. I mean, I just hear it increasingly, but again, it's hard to tell what exact number are actually coming back. But what is clear is that if that 200 million figure is right, the 200 million descendants, I mean, even if an infinitesimal percentage came back, that would change in some sense history, because I mean, there's only 15 million Jews. So again, you get 1%, that's 2 million new Jews. So we'll have to see what happens, but I mean, it would significantly bolster, the Jewish population worldwide. But that, again, remains to be seen, but it's definitely of interest. And as I said, I hear about it increasingly so many places around the world.
So thank you. I think, Kathy, I know
Yeah.
this is a fascinating talk, and there's lots of questions, and I'm really happy about that. I also want to respect Isaac's time,
Of
and
course.
so I think we're gonna cut it here. But thank you very much, Isaac, and you're welcome to remain on here for a little while for unstructured conversation. But otherwise, I'm going to call an end to the program. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Isaac.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So if everyone wants, they can stay on and chat more. Otherwise, you can have a good night.
I have another few minutes if anyone wants to, maybe 5 minutes if anyone wants to ask anything else. If not, no pressure.
Sure. Thema, I'm not able to stop the live stream on my end for some reason. Would you be
Yes,
able
I'll
to?
stop it. I'll stop the live stream.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Karam.
Yeah.
Peter, you don't have to raise your hand anymore.
Professor Karam and I were briefly colleagues when I was a professor at American Jewish University many, many years ago. So it's really nice to see him on this Zoom.
Yeah, very, very cool. Yeah.
My question is that family from the 18th century, the Mines.
Yes.
Did I pronounce it that? My last name is Moniz, M-O-N-E-S. So when I saw M-I-N-I, something popped. Can you tell me anything more about that family?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I know those two families came from Germany. They made it to Savannah. The families still remain in Savannah. I didn't meet the Minus when I was there. Sheftel's descendant is still a member of the synagogue, 8th generation. So he actually took me around to see the cemetery and some of the sites associated. So that was very cool. I believe that But yeah, Minus did not show up. But I was told they're still in Savannah. I'm sorry, I don't know though if they still retain affiliation with, the Jewish community, to this day, but they are around, and I think they're very proud of their history. But yeah, I don't know really anything else.
Okay, thanks. It was worth a shot.
Yeah.
When you were giving this presentation, Isaac, it got me thinking of Kol Nidre. We didn't grow up religious, so I didn't go to Kol Nidre services until I became an adult. Is there anything that you think is relevant with Kol Nidre and the Conversos?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So in the Western Sephardic liturgy, I believe if you look at the Spanish and Portuguese synagogues, there's actually a special prayer said on Yom Kippur. It still says, for our brethren who are imprisoned by the Inquisition, may their sins be forgiven. Or those who, so it still is recited today, even though again, the Inquisition's been abolished for 200 years. So that's one, that it's imprinted so deeply, right, that there's prayers still said. The other is that, yes, Encyclopedia Judaica, authored by Cecil Roth, or edited by Cecil Roth, there's an argument that maybe there was an influence of the Converso, the forced conversions, on the Kol Nidre about forgive us for the vows that we made, whether willingly or unwillingly or under duress, because we didn't intend to. So I don't know, again, 100% what the truth is to that. But one thing I didn't mention, because again, it starts to get a little nuanced, is even as early as the 6th, 7th centuries, in the time of the Visigoths, even before we talked about the Middle Ages, I mean, or being the High Middle Ages, Late Middle Ages, the Visigoths persecuted Jews intensely before the Muslims came in 711, and there seemed to be crypto Jews already in the time of the Visigoths. So we're looking at, say, 650, the year 650 CE. So I don't know exactly what date Kol Nidre was composed.